Welcome to War Room, the official podcast of the U.S. Army War College online journal, graciously supported by the Army War College Foundation. Please join the conversation at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. We hope you enjoy the program.
Make sure not to miss a single podcast and subscribe to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast, at iTunes, Google Play, or your favorite subscription service. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Army War College, U.S. Army, or Department of Defense.
Welcome to A Better Peace, the War Room podcast. I'm Ron Granieri, professor of history at the Department of National Security and Strategy at the U.S. Army War College and podcast editor of the War Room. It's a pleasure to have you with us. In 1993, the member states of the newly renamed European Union announced the creation of a common foreign and security policy. The CFSP, or to use the German term, which I am quite fond of, the Gemeinsame Außen- und Sicherheitspolitik, the GASP, was updated by the Lisbon Treaty of 2009, which established more permanent institutions and leadership for managing the external relations of the EU. Lisbon also created the Common Security and Defense Policy, the CSDP, the part of the GASP that relates to defense and crisis management, including defense cooperation and coordination among EU member states. The CSDP allows the EU to deploy civilian and military missions and operations abroad, including conflict prevention, peacekeeping, joint disarmament operations, military advice, humanitarian assistance, and post-conflict stabilization. In recent years, especially since the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, the CSDP has allowed the EU to play a more active role in international affairs, though the nature and extent of that role may not be quite clear to most Europeans, let alone to most Americans. Lucky for us, we have with us today a guest who can explain both the current and potential uses of the CSDP and what this EU initiative can mean for transatlantic relations and global geopolitics. Our guest is Rear Admiral Henning Faltin. He is the military advisor to the EU Delegations to the USA and to Canada, a position he has held since February 2023. Admiral Faltin has served in a variety of staff and command positions since he entered the Bundeswehr in 1985. His most recent positions before taking up his current job include serving as Deputy Director Operations at German Navy Headquarters in Rostock, Commander of German Operations Flotilla 1, and Director of the NATO Center of Excellence for Operations in Confined and Shallow Waters. As we wade into the deep waters of a transatlantic partnership, we are delighted to have him with us today on A Better Peace. Welcome, Admiral Faltin.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to be here today and tomorrow for this strategic competition. You might ask the question, what brings somebody like me in this position with the European Union?
Indeed.
After 5 years in operations and in command, I think the German military thought it's time to bring me back to policy, to security and strategy affairs. I served in the EU military staff in 2010 to 12. I also served in the EU affiliated headquarters in southern Germany. So the idea was to bring me in as a candidate for this position as EU military advisor, defense and defense attaché in the USA and Canada. I appreciated that. I got selected last year by the respective bodies of the European Union, the EU military staff and the External Action Service. And so in a way back to the European Union when I was a staff officer. I'm about to be in this function for another 2.5 years.
Interesting. So how big is the military staff around you as the attaché for the representations, and is it also multinational?
Well, the EU military staff itself is about 250 soldiers strong. It's a rather small entity in the European Union with some 35,000 people in the whole group of Commission, Council, European Defence Agency and others. Here in Washington, D.C., Our delegation is around 120, 130 people strong. I'm a single warrior. I have one Master Chief Petty Officer who does my administration. But when it comes to the content work, it's me. That is because the member states decide that we have only one military advisor in the respective countries. We are in the US and Canada, but we also, for example, in China. We have one in Indonesia and India, and around the globe in total at the moment 15 military advisors only. So it's a little bit of a first step. And whether there will be stronger staffs in the future, that needs to be seen.
It's an interesting question. And I think this is something for, as I say, for our American audience, but perhaps even for Europeans who are unaware of the structure of the EU is, how would you describe for a general audience the common security and defense policy of the EU, what it means practically and what its longer term ambitions might be?
Well, practically, let me go back a couple years, actually two-ish decades. Dayton Agreement with regards to the situation on the Balkans. The Balkan War, the Yugoslav War, demonstrated many things. One of them that the European Union or the Europeans didn't have an own military fit for the job. The United States, NATO had to do that job. And so the conclusion was drawn by EU member states at that time to develop a military capability consisting of the EU military staff, a staff element, the European Defense Agency. The discussion on the table was the European Army, which came and went again. And the third element is the European Security and Defense College. These entities were developed at the early 2000s. So constantly we developed structures within the European Union, always keeping in mind that we didn't want to duplicate resources. That's a very important point for most nations, that we don't duplicate to NATO. And it's also a concern, let's say, here in the United States or in Canada. So duplication needs to be avoided, but structures need to be built to have an added value capability. So what happened over the last 20 years is that the military staff grew a little bit. We developed another headquarter function. The military staff is not really a headquarter. It deals with personal issues, logistic issues, also operations, but not in terms of command and control. We developed a function, it's called Military Planning Conduct Capability, typical European Union term. It's often a capacity or capability, but to avoid standing structures. We developed training missions around the world. At the moment, we have more than 20 civilian and military training missions and operations. And so we grew into this role step by step. At present, 3 naval operations in the Mediterranean Irini, at the Horn of Africa, Atalanta, and in the Red Sea, Aspides. And many training missions from the Sahel region to the Gulf of Guinea to East Africa. Also civilian missions, for example, in Armenia. And what we the European Union say, our added value is not in deterrence and defense. The Lisbon Treaty actually precludes deterrence and defense, but it is in crisis management and in capacity building. And that's what we do. We call it our integrated approach of military and many civilian actors plus funding, which works pretty well once the country where we do that agrees to it.
Right. Well, and when you talk about no duplication, so it requires, I guess, in advance a degree of deconfliction between, say, missions that the EU may take up as the EU versus missions that NATO might take up as NATO, or that individual member states might take up as individual member states. At what level does that kind of deconfliction happen?
Well, a good example is Bosnia, I would say, Operation Althea, which started basically as a NATO operation. S4 became U4 with a little transition. That's a European Union operation. However, NATO shape has the function as operations headquarter. So NATO has a role. That is the Berlin Plus agreement, which is unique in the sense that it is only applied on Althea. In this scenario, you have forces on the ground which are commanded by the European Union, and you have forces, reserve forces over the horizon, which sometimes, in some cases, serve both for Bosnia but also for Kosovo, for KFOR. And it works pretty well. It's an agreement process. It's an agreement with a political process in Brussels. We have other operations, training missions mainly. Our missions are normally training or capacity building in regions where NATO is not active. NATO doesn't have troops on the ground in Africa. Beyond NATO's mandated area of operations. So we are there. We train forces in Mozambique. We train forces in Benin at the Gulf of Guinea coast, for example. We also tried to train forces in Mali and Niger, which didn't work out because the host nation bases went away. And then, of course, we have the military operations. Military operations, when I use that term, mean operations where we can use executive force. Training missions are missions where we don't use executive force, only for self-defense. In terms of the naval operations, anti-piracy, counter drug trafficking, operations to counter Houthi attacks. These are operations where we use military force, of course, and these forces, these operations are operations other than deterrence and defense.
Right.
And here is the added value of the European Union. We can do that. We can provide security in areas below deterrence and defense, always when NATO is not able or not willing to do that. And another example is Ukraine.
Right.
We, the European Union, have probably stepped up beyond belief what we do not only in terms of sanctions, not only in terms of refugee support, but in terms of military assistance for the Ukrainian armed forces. We have, shortly after the Russian invasion, developed a clearinghouse cell at the EU military staff. And through that clearinghouse cell, most support from EU member states, military support from EU member states, is delivered to Ukraine. There's a funding mechanism, a refunding mechanism through the European Peace Facility Ukraine, that's the term of it. We also coordinate closely with the US forces in Wiesbaden. We coordinate with the Canadians, the British. We coordinate with our training hubs in Poland, in Germany, and in other EU member states. And here the European Union is clearly of added value because, in my view, NATO could not have done this job so fast and to that extent without raising other questions of NATO's involvement in a war.
Very much so. Well, and there are two aspects of this that, as we talk about it, that strike me as interesting and also potentially complicating in the future. One is, are there, when particular units, or let's say particular ships, say in the Red Sea, when they are assigned to this EU operation, does that essentially make them taboo for the NATO operation, right? So, or is this based on is there a set time period at which, say, the organizations may rethink whether this or that frigate or this or that unit gets reassigned? That's one question. The other one is, how does the EU's especially the use of any kind of military force, how does this work with those members of the European Union who are not members of NATO and who consider themselves to be neutrals? So when I think about, say, the role of, say, an Ireland or an Austria, are they permanently assigned different types of duties as a result of this place? Or so how does one manage that overlap?
Yeah, thank you. I think is a very good question. Comes back to the issue: are we competition or is it cooperation?
Indeed.
It also comes back to the issue of single set of forces. So, which countries are not in NATO but in European Union? 4 countries: Austria, Ireland, Malta, and Cyprus. If you take Aspides, Operation Aspides in the Red Sea, naval operation where we have ships, all participants at the moment are from countries which are also in NATO. One thing is important to know: the European Union does not develop own tactics, standards, or procedures, but relies on NATO standard. That is important to know. And it is not an issue whenever we have forces from countries which are both in NATO and in the European Union. You asked about whether these units could be used under a NATO umbrella. Sure enough, and that's best practice from the last years. If you take Operation Irene in the Mediterranean, nations often chopped out, that's the term. They went from EU operational control to NATO operational control under NATO MARCOM, for example, for some specific tasks, or to national tasking, and then went back. So that is the same arrangement at Aspides. We have ships within the EU chain of command, which are associated also for NATO, for the US-led operation. And we have, of course, ships from EU member states under US command, Prosperity Guardian, which could assume tasks also in association with the European Union forces. Best practice. We exchange the picture. We have systems like link systems, data exchange systems, which can do that. When it comes to these 4 countries you mentioned and what they can do and what not, well, it is not that we need to coordinate that too much. Austria is very strong on the Balkans, very much engaged with Bosnia and also with Kosovo, but not in maritime terms.
Right.
Sure enough, they have no navy.
Not since Captain von Trapp.
Not since Captain von Trapp. You are right. And my Austrian defense attaché colleague probably doesn't like that statement too much, so I take that back.
I apologize in advance.
Take the example of Cyprus. Cyprus at the moment is playing a key role in the support for Gaza, the maritime bridge.
Sure.
So forces from all over the world, civilian and military, the US with a very strong contingent pretty soon, based on Cyprus, provide that support. So is there really an issue? I don't see that. Ireland is traditionally involved in training missions in Africa. Right. Had command there.
And peacekeeping operations.
Peacekeeping operations, absolutely. So I think in practical terms, as long as the European Union does not develop own standards, tactics, procedures which derive from NATO, we don't have to worry. Interoperability is ensured, and at the moment, it does not look like that.
Interesting. Because I'm just on a maritime level with you as a naval officer, since both Cyprus and Malta are important naval stations for the Eastern Mediterranean. So are there any restrictions on which EU ships engaged in some of these operations, can they use the ports in Malta and Cyprus, or is this something that has to be negotiated on a case-by-case basis?
I think any operation, or every military operation, is on a case-by-case basis, and if only for funding. Sure. I give you an example from another organization, United Nations. If you look at the Maritime Task Force of UNIFIL, the mission in Lebanon, the Maritime Task Force operates from different bases. I commanded one task group within that task force. I had Greek ships operating from Cyprus, and I had Turkish fast patrol boats operating from Turkey. We met at sea, and we did a great job. So here, NATO interoperability also helps. We did a great job. And so I think case by case is indeed the way forward, and then you find a solution.
There's obviously been a lot of talk, and I will confess to having a special interest in this because I'm working on some work on NATO and Germany in the 1960s. And as early as the 1960s, there was this discussion about creating a European pillar within NATO rather than being an alliance between individual states to be an alliance between continents. But this always ran into the problem of what would a European pillar of NATO look like? And so how do you see the process of European integration meshing with this desire for a sort of EU role in international affairs? And because there's a European president, there's a European foreign minister, as there were, but there is no European defense minister. How do you see this working? Well, I don't want to get you in any trouble. So but I'm curious how you imagine this.
Well, I think there is no European defense minister is right and wrong. As I said earlier, the European Union develops in small increments, and that is the case. And the reason being is simply that the whole area of security and defense, the common security defense policy and the common foreign and security policy, works by consensus of the member states.
Right.
So once all member states are agreeing with something, once they're happy, we move forward. Otherwise, it's sometimes not the case. So if you take the European External Action Service, which was formed some 11, 12 years ago, that European Security Defense, that European External Action Service, was a direct answer to the situation that we didn't have a foreign minister. Who do I call when I want to discuss foreign issues? I don't know someone.
Indeed.
Several leaders said that. So we had the High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Baroness Ashton. She was the first. Now it is the High Representative Borrell. So he is a foreign minister, if you want so, but also a defense minister. We have foreign affairs councils, and we have foreign affairs councils in the defense ministers format, and sometimes together. We call that the Jumbo Foreign Affairs Council. So it is the case that the European Union addresses with foreign and defense ministers issues on a very regular basis. Now the question you raised, what is the role for European defense, is an interesting one. I mentioned earlier the Lisbon Treaty precludes that the EU is the Organization for Deterrence and Defense. Basically, it says something like those member states who are also in NATO consider NATO as the Organization for Deterrence and Defense. The European Union, in this sense, has a supporting role. To support defense issues in Europe by the member states as a group. An example, the European Union Commission funds many things. One is they fund military mobility throughout Europe, from the landing sites, the ports of debarkation in Western Europe, all the way through Europe to the east, to the north, to the south. So that funding is coordinated. That infrastructure development is coordinated by the EU Commission.
Interesting.
And by member states.
So in other words, it helps to take some of the pressure off of individual member states by sharing the burden.
By sharing the burden, and also by providing a sort of coordination which otherwise might have taken maybe a little bit longer. So military mobility is a very good example of a joint approach of the European Union for defense. When we speak about European defense forces, a European army, I think that is something where we don't have consensus at the moment.
Right.
And so we have to look into the role of the European Union or of the European Union member states in deterrence and defense. And I think most member states, if not all, came to the conclusion a couple of years ago that they have to do more in defense. The security situation in Europe has changed. We had, for more than 20 years, a very peaceful environment in Europe. The peace dividend certainly was a driving factor. And nations spending on military, but also the size of the military forces was reduced.
Right.
And right so, because the perception was we have peace and we will have peace forever. Now, certain developments in and around Europe, and the last one is, of course, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. But earlier already the invasion on the Crimean Peninsula showed to member states who are NATO allies also that they have to do more.
Right.
Defense spending is going up. Defense forces are strengthened and modernized. So I think the way forward at the moment is that European Union member states do more for the defense, and the European Union plays a supporting role for this. At the moment, I don't see that the European Union itself will be that pillar for defense, but they also will not be but they will be certainly part of that game.
I see. In this ongoing discussion about European strategic autonomy, the goal is for Europe to be able to play the roles that circumstances require Europe to play, right? Not necessarily, Europe's not planning on striking out on its own, but to be prepared to deal with a more complicated world situation. How does I know that the war in the Middle East, the war in Gaza, which then had its carryover with the fight with the Houthis creating the difficulties in the Red Sea. How does the ongoing conflict in Gaza impact operations for the European Union in the Eastern Mediterranean? Is this something you just have to avoid, or is there a role that the EU can play in peacekeeping or regional stabilization?
I answer first to that specific question, and then I have a comment on strategic autonomy.
Sure.
The European Union CSDP missions and operations happen only in areas which are mandated.
Aha.
So we have a mandated area for Irene,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't stretch to the Eastern Mediterranean off the coast of Gaza.
Gotcha.
So we are not operating under a European Union flag over there. We can hoist the flag whenever we have a mandated area. So there is a deconfliction just by the mandate.
Sure.
And that doesn't preclude member states, of course, to operate in that area, and they do that often. And that doesn't preclude member states to collect data and provide maritime situational awareness in that area. But the European Union is not operating under a European Union flag off the coast of Gaza. Coming to strategic autonomy, this is a very interesting term because my impression is it's often demonized.
Mm-hmm.
It is a black and white picture which is painted. If Europe is not operating in NATO, then there is strategic autonomy and the Europeans, they step away from NATO. That is certainly not the case. Strategic autonomy is an important term. We have to be able to operate, even militarily, whenever NATO is not willing or cannot operate. And Africa is the best example. Mm-hmm. Strategic autonomy of the European Union in Africa is the driving factor for our missions, for our capability missions, and for our training missions in Africa. Strategic autonomy in Europe for defense needs to be balanced with the question of single set of forces and with the avoidance of duplication. That is something what we do on a weekly basis when we have our meetings of the EU Military Committee or of the Political and Security Council of the European Union. That's an ambassadors level council on top of the military level. And then, of course, member states have different positions on what strategic autonomy means. But bottom line is a bit of autonomy might be very good. Mm-hmm. And we are watching developments. We watch statements here from U.S. administration and leadership with regards to Europe, taking into account that the United States has a pacing challenge somewhere else on this planet. We, as Europeans, we see that we have to do more. Mm-hmm. So strategic autonomy is not bad. It is actually pretty good because it allows the Europeans to do more, and that relieves U.S. forces and that relieves other forces in Europe if it works well.
Right. Well, yes, one would think that having your friends get stronger should be good for everybody, right? That seems to be the idea. So your current assignment, you say, it is a 3-year assignment, or how long is it? A 4-year assignment? How long is there no formal time period?
There is a formal time period. There's a contract with the European Union, and that contract, in my case, was signed for 2 years.
2 years. Okay.
I just applied for a 3rd year that got granted both by my home country, Germany, and also by the European Union, because otherwise I would have left just after the US elections and would have avoided all that input, let's say. So I will stay another year into early 2026.
Right. Where was your predecessor from?
Well, my predecessor, that's an interesting question, was also German.
Uh-huh.
He was a German general. He was the first on the post. The post was implemented 2020. It was a German 1-star general, Fritz Orbach, and he retired. Mm-hmm. But the position is not a German position. Mm-hmm. It's every member state can apply for these positions, be it in China. There we have a general from the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Mm-hmm. We have an Italian in India, for example. Mm-hmm. So the member states can apply. And then there's a selection process. And if you make it through the selection process as number 1, you're in.
You're in. Fair enough. I'm always interested in questions, and we are always interested. We are the Army War College, but we also want to promote jointness. And so I'm curious, what is your sense of the of jointness between the services within the Bundeswehr, within Germany, or that you see in your counterpart states elsewhere in Europe? How do you see the relationship between the Navy and the Army, for example?
Well, the overarching goal should be that we maybe march separate but hit together.
Right, for sure.
Getrennt marschieren, gemeinsam schlagen. Sorry for the German term, but that is behind it.
Indeed.
It needs to be synchronized. Mm-hmm. It needs to be aligned to a common objective, and then there are lines of operation. And the question of supported commander is, of course, of issue. That's the military part of it. You have cultural differences. You have that within armies. Mm-hmm. You have it even within navies.
Indeed.
And you need to overcome these cultural differences. Sometimes they are very important. If you are from a submarine community, you are certainly thinking different than coming from a frigate or aircraft carrier community.
Totally.
But the overarching alignment is important. Mm-hmm. You don't want to get rid of identities, but you want to align them to one goal. And I think that is a constant task, because you have to do it. It will not happen by itself. You wouldn't need operational planning if that would happen by itself. But I think it is important to acknowledge that every service, depending on the situation, on the mission, has a role. And the Navy certainly has a very strong role if it's blue water or if it's from the sea.
Indeed. That is a good principle for military planning. It's a good principle for alliance relations as well. And it is, of course, a basic principle of the European Union, that you have many different identities, but working together for a common goal. And what you've described today is of how the European Union handles this is very interesting. Admiral Henning Faltin, thank you so much for joining us on Our Better Peace to talk about your work. And good luck going forward in Washington and whatever comes after that.
Thank you very much. I don't know what comes after that, but I certainly enjoy Washington, D.C. and Ottawa.
And Ottawa, that's right. We should, and Ottawa as well. Well, thank you, Admiral. And thank you to everyone out there listening for joining us today on A Better Peace. Please send us your comments on this program and all the programs. Send us your suggestions for future programs. We're always interested in hearing from you. And after you have listened to this conversation and you realize the variety of approaches that we provide here on A Better Peace, please take a moment and subscribe to A Better Peace on your podcatcher of choice. And after you have subscribed, take a moment to rate and review this podcast, because that's how more people can find out about us. We're always interested in growing this community for conversations like this one. And even though this conversation is over, we look forward to welcoming you to the next one. And so, until next time, from the War Room, I'm Ron Granieri.
And that concludes our program. Thank you for listening. The views expressed in this podcast reflect those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views, policies, or positions of the U.S. Army or the Department of Defense. Let us know what you think. Provide us your feedback, comments, or suggestions through our webpage at warroom.armywarcollege.edu. And have a great day.